All right, and we are live. Hello, everyone. I hope everyone's doing well this evening. My name is Anastasia, and I am the events manager for Bank Square Books and Savoy Bookshop and Cafe. And we're so delighted that you were able to tune in to this evening's virtual event. Just a few quick pieces of business before we begin. I just want to call to attention a few different features of Crowdcast, the platform we're using this evening. There's a chat window on the right-hand side of your screen, so you can interact virtually during the event. If you're going to participate in the chat, please do so with respect and kindness. You can also ask authors and Rick questions by submitting them through the Ask a Question button. And we'll get to as many as we can during the event, which will run for about an hour. If you're having trouble with the stream, you'll see a question mark at the top right of your screen, and that will help you troubleshoot any issues you may be experiencing. Worst case scenario, if the stream is really giving you a hard time, you can always X out and log back in. Sometimes that works. If you'd like to purchase a book, you can do so at the green button at the bottom of the video stream below us here. And that'll take you to our website where you can complete your purchase. Event sales do take a little bit longer for us to fulfill, so just give us a little bit of extra time to get those orders processed for you. We did talk to Clay, and he is happy to sign some book plates. So if you would like one, you can add that in your order comments. That'll take a little bit longer just because we're going to mail them to him and he'll send them back. But we can absolutely make that happen. All right, so I am delighted to introduce another installation of our Read of the Day book club put on in partnership with the New London Day. This month, we're happy to be hosting Clay Risen to discuss his book, The Crowded Hour. Clay will be in conversation with Rick Koster, an arts columnist at The Day, and he is the champion of the Read of the Day book club. So just a little bit about Rick and Clay. Rick has been working as an arts and culture writer for The Day for over 20 years, and he specializes in covering music, books, and dining. And he also writes a weekly humor column known as Rick's List, and he's an all-around stand-up guy. Clay is the deputy op-ed editor at the New York Times, and in addition to writing The Crowded Hour and other acclaimed books about American history, he has also written 2 books about whiskey, one of which is touted as the definitive guide to American whiskey. Clay resides in Brooklyn, New York. So Clay and Rick are going to discuss The Crowded Hour for about 25-30 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to your questions that have been submitted through the Ask a Question button. All right, and I'm going to turn it over to Clay and Rick, and I'm going to turn my screen off and let you guys chat about the book.
Thank you, Anastasia. And Clay, it's a pleasure to see you, not in person, but when we spoke last week, we were just on the old-fashioned telephone.
Close enough, yeah.
And we both got the directive to wear white collared shirts.
No, what are the chances? But yeah. Well, we know how to dress. We're Southern. Yeah.
We are Southern gentlemen, aren't we?
Well, men and gentlemen. I'll let you speak.
I can't even spell gentleman, so we'll take that into consideration. The Crowded Hour is a book about Theodore Roosevelt and the Rough Riders at the turn of the 20th century, which is, of course, when they took part in the Spanish-American War. The title of the book, The Crowded Hour, works on a couple of levels because it does describe events that were happening post-Civil War as we went into the new century. And it also describes Teddy Roosevelt, or so it seems to me. Can you explain a little bit about why you call it The Crowded Hour and how it does apply to both those and overlaps?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks, Rick, so much for making this possible, and obviously to Anastasia, and the folks at Bank Street. It's a wonderful bookstore we were just talking about. The time I stumbled in there and spent way too long and way too much money. Look, can you ever spend too much money on books? I don't know. Well, look, The Crowded Hour, you're right. It operates on a couple of levels. So the first, and they're really the kind of three, I think, the 3 levels that I hope the narrative, the story works on. The first one is Theodore Roosevelt himself. In his memoirs, when he would talk about his time in the Spanish-American War, and in particular the Battle of San Juan Heights, which he's most famous for, he referred to it as his crowded hour. And it's a phrase from an old poem from the 18th century that was actually still pretty popular at the time, in the late 19th century. So people would have gotten the reference. And it was a reference to the kind of the rush of battle, the sort of the way that everything in a life reduces to that moment. And Roosevelt saw that moment in the battle and in the war in general for him as his crowded hour. It was the moment that, and I think this is true, is the moment when his life really turned. On a superficial level, it's the moment when he really became a national celebrity, a national hero, and vaulted him eventually into the presidency. But I think it's also the moment when a lot of things that were coursing through his life, a lot of ideas, a lot of changes in his life, really kind of came to a head and allowed him to enter a new chapter. So I think when you think about Roosevelt's life and just his biography, this moment is really important. I call it the crowded hour also because you look at, I try to tell the story not just of Roosevelt, but of this regiment, the Rough Riders, and the sort of unique collection of volunteer soldiers and their place within the war. The war was very brief. It was a couple of months of fighting, strictly speaking. And yet it was so important. And it was such a moment in these men's lives. It was such a, there's so much packed into it. I mean, there was so much that I left out of the story of the Spanish-American War that, I don't know, if I were able to write a longer book, maybe I'd have included it, but it is a very crowded story. But then the last way that it operates, and this is the sort of the largest macro level of the narrative, is that it's the crowded hour for the country. It's the late 19th century, turn of the century was a moment when America was transitioning from being a mostly agrarian country, a mostly isolationist country, to being entering into the century when it would become a world power, when it would really dominate global culture, and in a way that we're still seeing that today, 122 years later. And I think the war was so important in bringing to an end certain aspects of American culture, of American politics. McKinley, who was the president at the time, he was the last Civil War president. He was the last president who had served in the Civil War. Roosevelt, who succeeded him, was the first of a new generation. And he was put in that position as a result of his experience in the war. And so all of this kind of comes together. There are a lot of other aspects of culture that kind of transitioned at that time. And so what I hope the book does is not just tell the story of Roosevelt or the regiment, but also of America at this moment and why it's such an important time for us to understand.
Yeah, it does do that, Clay, by the way. So many, I remember graduating high school and I got a biography of Teddy Roosevelt from a relative. So I guess the point of that is, since I am as old as Teddy Roosevelt, that there's been a lot written about Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. What I was interested in, and yes, you have a very distinctive angle, as you just described, 3 of them, when you wrote the book proposal. What did you learn from the time you signed the contract till you typed the end about Roosevelt that maybe completely surprised you, maybe even caused the narrative to pivot a little bit, that you didn't know?
One of the things that I think a lot of the Roosevelt biographies, and I don't want to say all of them, but a lot of them that I feel personally maybe get wrong about him, is that it's kind of a classic mistake of biography and here, a great person biography, right? Where you want to read this story because this person built up a career that was worth taking note of. And it's very easy to read backward in that and to say, well, this person became president, or this person became a Nobel Prize winner, or whatever. And therefore, everything that leads up to that is kind of a linear storyline, right? One thing leading to the next. And I think a lot of Roosevelt biographies do that. And what I found And I certainly did that in my proposal. What I found and what I try to argue in the book is that, Roosevelt was someone who had immense talents, was an incredibly intelligent, wide-ranging person. He certainly had lots of achievements early in his life, but they didn't actually add up to much. And Roosevelt himself felt this when he was, entering the sort of late middle age or late 30s, entering middle age. He's 38 when he joined the army to go to Cuba, so he was not young, and not old, but not young. And he wrote to friends several times. He wrote about how he felt that the world had passed him by. It's very easy to look at his early writings, and he's very vainglorious. He's very he sort of sees himself as this world historical actor when he has no claim to be that. He's a member of the New York State Assembly. He's a rancher. He's a writer, all of which are fine things to do, but they don't put you in the pantheon of world figures. And so you can pick that stuff up and say, oh, see, he thought he was all that. But the fact is that he actually felt kind of at outs. He felt like the world had passed him by. And then this opportunity comes up and he grabs it. And so that's one thing about Roosevelt that I think I learned. And then the war really transformed him. And the other thing that I think is important, we think of Roosevelt, and of course he thought of himself this way, as a great leader. And as president, there's a lot to say in favor of that picture. He was a great leader. He was a great politician, a great persuader, great speaker. But up until the Spanish-American War, he actually really didn't have that much experience as a leader. He had led men in when he was a rancher. He had men working for him. When he was working for the New York Police Commission, he had a leadership role. But those were often brief experiences and not anything like the intensity of his war experience. And what I found and what I try to argue in the book is that the war transformed Roosevelt. It both brought out aspects of his personality that made him a leader, but he was also someone who had, I think, an even more important quality, which was he knew how to learn and how to build himself as a leader. So there are all these great anecdotes in the book of how he went to subordinates. So he went to, the regiment, the Rough Riders. There were a number of veterans who were served in the Rough Riders, and they had re-upped after retiring from the military. And he would go to them and he would say, well, what do we do here? What do we do here? I was reading this book, this field manual, and it says this. What do we do? And he was very humble in that regard, but it also made him a better leader. And then you look at his career, not just a couple of years later, he was president. And you look at how he led as president, and you can see how he must have picked these things up from that war experience. And so what I hope, just in terms of biography and so the biographical treatment of Roosevelt, the one thing I hope the book contributes is that understanding, because I think a lot of books, when they tell the Rough Rider story, a lot of biographies of Roosevelt, they sort of treat it as this kind of, well, it's important to his elevation as a celebrity. It's kind of an interesting story. It's kind of a fun story, but they kind of leave it at that. And I actually think it's a really pivotal story in his life.
Yeah, and I think I got a lot out of that I didn't know or expect. I was particularly in that context impressed by Leonard Wood, excuse me, as a sort of mentor. We'll get to that in a second. But yeah, you're spot on with that. And the thing that really impresses me the most when you're conveying that about Roosevelt, as the narrative does, is that there is a lot of research and a lot of facts you had to gather and present in order to make this book work. At the same time, as with when we talked last week, I think I mentioned The Killer Angels and Dispatches, the book about Vietnam, as war reporting, one's fiction, but nonetheless, that the narrative is equal to the reporting. I don't know that that's something that's easy to balance. Do you think about that as you write the entire book?
Absolutely. And look, I picked the story partly because it's not hard to draw a really taut narrative out of this story. And one of the great joys of researching this was being confident that there was a really taut, clear narrative line that it was mine to lose, and that it was all about finding the details, the side stories, the characters that would flesh that out. And I knew from the beginning that I didn't want to tell a story that was only about Theodore Roosevelt. He's an important part of this, obviously, and he's an important part of the narrative. But I really wanted to tell the story also of the Rough Riders and to pull out characters. These are 1,000 men. And I was convinced from the beginning that I would be able to find, more than a handful of these characters who would really, not just be interesting, but actually be deep enough and compelling enough and significant enough symbolically to help tell a bigger story. So the book is full of these young men who gave up whatever their career was to go off to war, and they were inspired by war stories that their fathers had told them from the Civil War. They were inspired by an idealism that drew on American values. They were inspired by an adventurism born of a country that was really rapidly industrializing, that had national news media where they knew these stories, and they were, you couldn't keep them down on the farm. One figure, and he was not a Rough Rider, so he's not really in the book, but the poet Carl Sandburg is a great example of someone who grew up on a farm or grew up in a small town and saw the Spanish-American War as an opportunity to get out of his little world and to go off and do something. And so, there are all these characters like that. And so they both tell a taut story, this through line, but they also illuminate kind of a bigger picture. And yeah, that was one of the real joys of writing this book, was just knowing that, having this hypothesis is, you might say, sort of like a guess that this is what it was going to be. And then actually finding those stories and being able to then sit down with all of them and collate them and come up with a narrative that, you're right. And in some ways, if you pick up a biography of Theodore Roosevelt, you're going to get the basic story. But I wanted to tell a story that was, I wanted to tell it in a way that fleshed that out and made it read like you'd never heard it before.
It's fascinating because the way you describe it, it was a bit of a crapshoot for you. As you say, there were 1,000 Rough Riders, so you could probably rely on the assumption successfully that you were going to find those characters, but you didn't really know who might be there. And as I read, I found myself wanting, I just mentioned a few minutes ago, the surgeon and the military colonel Leonard Wood, who was every much, I suppose you would say, Roosevelt's equal in terms of leading the Rough Riders. There was the journalist Richard Harding Davis. There was Hamilton Fish.
Yeah.
Over and over again. And I would read novels. I would read biographicals of any of these guys.
Well, I'll tell you, you'll hate to hear this, but an early draft of the book, had a lot about Leonard Wood, a lot of his backstory, because he's fascinating to me. He grew up. He's a New England guy. He grew up in Cape Cod, went to Harvard Medical School. Got sick of he was a surgeon. I mean, he worked in New York as a surgeon and got sick of it and joined the Army, went out west, helped hunt down Geronimo, won the Medal of Honor, coached football at Georgia Tech. Back then you could do that. There's all these, Yeah, it ends up as the surgeon. I mean, the White House doctor. That's what he was. Yeah, no, he's fascinating. Same thing with Richard Harding Davis. There was a whole backstory with him that, he's still a character in the book, but I trimmed that. On the flip side, Hamilton Fish was a hard guy to find material about. I just couldn't, his papers may be hidden somewhere, or papers from his family. The Fish family in New York is a very prominent old family. They may have papers. I could not. I mean, I contacted some of them. Some members of the family, they didn't really have anything to tell me. So, and that's unfortunately the limits of nonfiction, right? You can't write what isn't there.
Right.
The two characters that I really wanted to build out, I mean, notwithstanding those guys, but the number 1 and the number 2 tennis players in the country, they quit tennis to become Rough Riders, and then after they were both combat experience, they were down in Cuba. They came back and they both went back into tennis and each of them won multiple US Opens. They're both in the Tennis Hall of Fame. Fascinating, I think.
Yeah.
Now,
it is.
Neither of them really left much of a paper trail. So you sort of go with what you can find. And, fortunately there were characters who did leave, or there were soldiers, they're not just characters, who did leave really good records. They left letters, they left diaries. In some cases they left, full memoirs that they wrote later. But it is sort of the, like you said, the crapshoot of nonfiction, or especially history writing, narrative history. You can't say what isn't there. You can't make stuff up. So,
right. No. Coming after this, I hadn't planned on this question, so bear with me for a minute. But coming after the Civil War, which was still the bloodiest conflict, I believe, in our military history, it seems a little odd, at least in the context of today, how many young men were still really eager to go into battle. I don't know that it's, say, post 9/11, it would be as reflective as that period. Does that make sense?
It does. And yet it is exactly what happened. Roosevelt's a good kind of avatar for this, because even though he was 38 years old, his father famously did not serve in the Civil War. His father hired, you could do this at the time, he hired a replacement to serve in his place. And there's all kinds of psychobiography about what that meant for Roosevelt. But the point is that Roosevelt was of that age, and he grew up with stories of Civil War valor all around him. One of his earliest memories was watching a parade, a Civil War, soldiers going off to parade. And, young men younger than him also grew up on these stories. And, it's one of the things, I think I do think that there's a certain timelessness about this. And it's a tragic timelessness, because it's one of the reasons why we as human beings continue to do this terrible thing called war. And that is that, as searing and as terrible as an experience as it is for individuals when they go off to it, many people who hear those stories, particularly when they're children or grandchildren, they hear those stories and they want it. They want to go to war. They're driven. One of the characters in the book, who I was lucky enough to find a diary and letters and whatnot, is a young man named Theodore Miller. And Theodore Miller, his father was a rich industrialist in Akron, Ohio. He went to Yale. He was studying law in New York, and he really wanted to go join the Rough Riders. Wanted to go off to war in any way. And his father had been a little older than the Civil War. His father was too old to serve in the Civil War, but he knew the stories. His father had, all kinds of first-hand experience of friends and his own relatives being killed in the Civil War. And he told his son, I can't lose you. I can't let you do this. I know how terrible this is. And my generation has invested so much in preventing America from ever going to war again. It was part of the, almost the ideology of that generation, of the Republican Party, which dominated American politics at the time, of American business, that we would not go to war again. I don't want to compare it. I think this is not the best comparison, but maybe in some ways it works. It's in a little ways, it's like Germany after World War II, a generation that was just absolutely committed to the lessons of the war and to dedicating themselves to letting that never happen again. But times change, generations change, and a new generation of people can't help but rushing into the fire that their mothers and fathers spent so long trying to get out of.
And it just is, I won't say something as trivial as convenient, but yes, at the turn of the century when the war took place, all of a sudden there were many reasons a lot of our politicians, if you want to say philosophers, thought for imperialism or colonialism or expanding our role as whether the policemen of the world and of course that feeds into exactly what his dad didn't want him to do.
Yeah.
For the whole country.
Yeah. I mean, Roosevelt's also interesting because as a young man, in his 20s and 30s, he was a leading advocate of imperialism, of expansion into the world. He was the opposite of the isolationists that really kind of ruled that generation and really kind of, controlled American foreign policy and culture and government up through the end of the 19th century. And yet Roosevelt was a strong advocate of going the other direction, building a strong army, building a strong navy, getting the economy out there, taking over, whether directly or indirectly, territory, right? So he advocated, U.S. expansion to control Hawaii. Certainly through the Spanish-American War, we acquired for a time being Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and but there was also an idealism there, and an idealism that Roosevelt believed in, and I think a lot of people in that generation believed in, that America was a force for good, and that while France or Britain or Russia or any European country, their imperialism was a bad thing, right? They were colonialists, they were extractionists, they only went into countries to take their resources. Roosevelt and his generation, they told a different story about America, and we were the America that was bringing Enlightenment American values to the rest of the world. Now, people at the time and certainly since then can see through that myth and say, well, that's not what happened. We took over the Philippines and we destroyed it and we used it as a colony, even if we didn't call it a colony. America has not always been a force for good, and that's all true. And yet the myth is not wrong, because America does have these values, and there's something to be said for people who believe that those values should animate the way that our country engages with the world. But I think ultimately there's a paradox that you can't get away from, which you read. There's a great book on Vietnam, and it's there's several great books on Vietnam, but the things they carry really animates. I mean, you think about the way that the book opens, and it's a very idealistic. We're going to war to help people, and I'm going to war to help people, and it falls apart so quickly. And almost inevitably, it falls apart. Like, you can't imagine the Vietnam War being any other way, and yet it was animated by a certain idealism. And so I tried to bring that into this story, because we don't think about the Spanish-American War in this way. We think about it as a purely imperialist war. We think about it as an accidental war. But I actually think that it's a prototype war for the kinds of conflicts that America fought, very often in the 20th century and into the 21st century. The Spanish-American War is a prototype for Vietnam. And it's a prototype for the Iraq War. And you can look at the way people talked about going into Vietnam and the way people talked about going into Iraq. And then you look at the way that people talked about going into a war with Spain to free Cuba, and it's the exact same rhetoric. And that's to me, and just I've gone on long enough, but to me, that's one of the things that history can do. History doesn't, as Mark Twain says, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. History also doesn't tell us literal stories that we have to take into account, but it shows us continuity. It shows us change. It allows us to see that our moment, whatever it is not unique. That this has been, we as a country, we as human beings, we've been here before, and we've made these mistakes, and we'll make them again. So history enlightens, but it also humbles.
It's interesting you said, and you can see that I'm not 22 years old, and so I can't even say that with my eyesight that hindsight is 20/20. I'm not sure even about that. But you're speaking about our role, sort of in a military sense, to expand our philosophy, if you will. You're also the author of two highly regarded books, one on Martin Luther King Jr. and the other on the Civil Rights Act. So let's shift a little bit, even though it's not about the crowded hour necessarily, but you're writing about two things with those books that reflect what's happening in society. And I would suggest also that we're seeing that happen again right now in a way that maybe has never existed in our country. You tell me if you think that's accurate, or if does this make sense?
It does. I mean, so I've thought about that a lot, and thought about these two books that I wrote. The Martin Luther King book was really a study of the week after Martin Luther King was assassinated. So, a week-long period. There were protests, marches, riots, much more destructive than anything we've seen in the last couple of weeks. Certainly, just in terms of lives lost, scores of people were killed and left homeless, and it was a terrible week-long experience, but also a very transformative moment for the country. And and then the Civil Rights book was, a history of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. What I tried to do with that book was really to show that this story that is often told about Washington politics, that it's purely about the filibuster, purely about Lyndon Johnson. As with my other books, those are important characters. I don't want to diminish them. Those are important stories. But what I tried to do with that book was to show how central the civil rights movement and the movements around it, the labor movement, religious groups, whether there's Jewish groups played an incredibly important role. Black Southern Baptists played an important role. White Episcopalians and Protestants of all sorts from the Midwest played an important role, and they were fairly coordinated. And I tried to make the argument that the bill would not have happened without people power, right? That it's not just this politics story, that it's actually about people like Martin Luther King, but also other people around him and other people who didn't necessarily work with him, but were working toward the same goal. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind today, is that, when we, in the wake of these protests and George Floyd's murder, we're looking for answers, and we're looking to political leaders for answers. And I think the important thing, and I don't want to preach something that other people don't know. It's probably obvious, but I hope the history informs them that change isn't just about letting the politicians decide, that it's actually something about the pressure of mass movements. And that's one of the great things I think we've seen the last couple of weeks is the power of people in the streets, people organizing, people protesting, and just engaging in all forms of activism can actually get things done very quickly. And unfortunately, I think when it comes to politics and when it comes to national politics, we're not necessarily going to see the change that everyone wants without continued pressure. And the Civil Rights Act was many years in coming, and it took many, many months of struggle to get pushed forward. And I think we need the same sort of thing today. But nevertheless, and just to your question, I don't think that these are parallel times at all. What we're experiencing today and what we experienced in 1968 or 1964, they're huge differences. And it's important not to look at it through a lens, through a crystal clear hindsight lens and say, well, things happened this way back then, so they'll happen that way today. It's much more about, what sort of lessons, what sort of experiences inform the way that we think about today, but don't necessarily serve as this kind of ABC guide.
I do hope that that there have been cumulative lessons learned that would move this forward.
That's kind of the. I can't speak for other people who write about history, but that's one of the things that I go back and forth on. Is there kind of a progressive view of history? Do we learn things from here, from A to B to C? Do we accumulate experience? I think sometimes we do. I think there are lessons that we learn, and certainly you can point to individual examples. At the same time, I think that the humans are, for better and worse, humans are imperfect entities, and we make the same mistakes over, and we do it in our own lives, but we certainly do it in history. And the humility of being a writer engaged with history is to know that whatever you write, you might want it to be a lesson, but it's not going to be taken as a lesson. But maybe some people will, and maybe some individuals will see it that way. And all you can do is just sort of hope for the best, but know that in the end, things are going to be imperfect.
We are, of course, speaking with Clay Bryson, the author of The Crowded Hour, and he has no books about drinking water, which he just was, but he does have a couple of books about whiskey.
I also have books. Yeah, it's after 6, so I'm not.
Yeah,
I don't. I'm drinking whiskey.
I've been known to drive more than one person to drink, so that would be part of it too, possibly. But perhaps, and we could never, when we spoke for the first time last week, Clay, we would never have thought this recent event would come up. But feel free to comment or not to comment, because it has nothing to do with the Crowded Hour. But the American Museum of Natural History in New York City is going to remove a prominent statue of Theodore Roosevelt, partly as what some would say was his role in imperialism or colonialism, whatever one might think either way. Does that draw on you any sort of a reaction that you would like to speak on?
I've thought a lot about this, and I actually think so. Ted Roosevelt IV, who is one of Roosevelt's great grandsons, he made a very persuasive argument that I think I agree with, which was that there's the statue is not a statue to Roosevelt. It's a statue involving Roosevelt, and certainly makes him he's a central figure. But it's really a statue that's kind of hard not to read in any other way other than a statue or a monument, whatever you want to call it, in praise of a form of imperialism. You look at the figures that are standing next to Roosevelt, and it's a Native American and a man of African descent who may be a formerly enslaved person. He may be an African. It's kind of unclear. My understanding of the artist's intent was that these are really stand-ins for an entire peoples, right? So not, there's no one person behind Roosevelt. There are multitudes of people represented by these two. And, it's tough to see that and not see that, yes, there might have been a progressive intent there, right? Roosevelt is leading everyone toward a freer, more liberated, more enlightened world, but he's also clearly dominant. These figures are subservient. And, when you have it out in front of a museum, there's no context. And you can imagine a plaque, you can imagine some kind of a display, but it's really not going to work in any way that really puts that statue in any kind of context that makes it clear what's going on. And I don't think there's really a favorable. So I think that, to me, I guess I come down after a while in favor of removing the statue. Hopefully, I'm not in favor of iconoclasm. I think there's some statues that we need to get rid of. I grew up in Nashville, and I am not sad to see a bunch of Confederate statues go down, but that's because those are people who rebelled against our. I think there's a clear case there. Generally speaking, I'm averse to iconoclasm, but I also think that there's probably a better place for a statue like that, one that embeds it within context. And we'll see what the museum or what the city, it's the city's property. We'll see what the city does with it. But, I also think it's first and foremost important to be sympathetic to the citizens of New York who own that statue. That is their property. And it does seem to be the consensus that statue does not represent their values and doesn't represent the history that they want to see in their public spaces. So I think it's, setting everything else aside, I think that's hard to argue with. Yeah. So those are my thoughts. I understand it's a very testy issue, and I also appreciate that other people feel differently.
Absolutely. All right. Yes, I was about to say, Anastasia, are you lurking around somewhere?
Yes, here I am. And I wanted to jump in. And Clay, I really have to say, this whole conversation has been incredibly poignant and interesting. I admit I was a history major in college, so I'm all for this. But, I think especially talking about statues and in the current climate that we're in, that was a really compelling and, again, poignant way of looking at it that I think sort of connected a lot of disparate threads about where people are feeling about this. So that was awesome. Thank you so much. That was really great. So there are a couple questions from the audience who have been surprisingly quiet in the chat, guys. I'm kind of surprised by that. But some days the audience, no comments. Okay, so let's see. First up, can you tell us, is there anything that you learned in your research for the Crowded Hour about Roosevelt and or the Rough Riders that stood out to you or surprised you? Maybe a fact that not everyone knew. Don't spoil the whole book because we want people to buy a copy and read it, but maybe a little teaser.
Yeah. So, there are lots of stories. There are lots of fun stories about the Rough Riders. The fact that they were so popular at the time is one of the things that was compelling to me. And they were popular because people loved these characters. So, they organized, the regiment was sort of organized and trained in San Antonio. And, they were a media circus. I mean, there were dozens of reporters every day around the Rough Riders. And one of the things I tried to balance was, there's the image of the Rough Riders, which is, these are a bunch of, is kind of a dirty dozen times 1,000. These are rough and tumble near criminals who come together and go off. And that's not quite accurate. There were all sorts. There were some criminals. They certainly had a variety of backgrounds, and it's very colorful. And they would sneak, a certain number would sneak out of camp every night and go into San Antonio and get drunk and have to be carted back. And but the other thing that I think is important is that these men were very serious about what they were doing. They weren't soldiers, but they were very serious about being soldiers. And one of the things that really clicked was that they were very committed to the job, and Roosevelt himself was very committed to making everything work, and they were very committed to him. And one of the things I try to bring out through a lot of little stories is that dynamic. So one of my favorite stories is Roosevelt had been he went out on a march with these soldiers when they were training, and they marched, I don't know, however many miles, and it was San Antonio and in late May. It was terrible heat, humidity, and they get back, and all around the camp had been set up these kind of makeshift bars. It just some lean-tos and people serving beer. And Roosevelt brought the men up and he said, "Okay, you guys have done a great job. I'm going to buy, open tab on me, drink. But if you get drunk, you will have to answer to me. So have at it." Right? And the men loved it, right? Well, that night, Rick, you were talking about Leonard Wood. So Leonard Wood was the commander of the unit. Roosevelt was his second. And Leonard Wood had all of his officers together, and he said, I'm paraphrasing, but he said, it's come to my attention that this afternoon, one of my officers treated a certain number of soldiers to beer and fraternized with them. And this is not acceptable, and I will not allow this kind of thing to happen. And this is pretty embarrassing, actually. And he kind of left it at that. And then he went off and he went back to his tent. And a few minutes later, Roosevelt showed up and he said, "Sir," and these guys were best friends, but Roosevelt respected that this was his boss. And he said, "Sir, I only have to say that I am the damnedest ass in the American Army. That is all. Good night." And it's funny. It's a great story, right? But Roosevelt did stuff like that. He did things to endear himself to the men, not really out of any kind of ploy. It was just who he was. It was the kind of man he was. And so there are all kinds of stories like that that animate the book.
Wow, that's awesome. It really does speak to painting a picture of this character, person truly, but of his character. And
yeah,
I think especially in history, you often, when you're learning about history, if you're especially on a very surface level as a student in high school or even in college, if you're not doing the deep dive, you learn about people and you learn these facts, and those facts become who they are. And often, stories about personality or those little anecdotal things get lost. So it's really cool to sort of hear that side of things, I think.
Yeah, it's what makes narrative history a lot of fun.
Yes, exactly. All right, let's see. Judy asks, have you been in contact with the Roosevelt family? And then in parentheses, it says Tweed Roosevelt. And are you a member of the TRA, the Theodore Roosevelt Association?
Yes to both. Tweed and I are decent friends.
Cool.
And I also know Ted Roosevelt, who different grandfathers. So Tweed is descended along one son, and Ted the other one. There are other Roosevelts, but those are the two that I know, and I know Tweed decently well. I actually commissioned. He wrote an article for me. When I wear my day job hat at the New York Times, I commission op-eds, and I commissioned him to write a piece after the the incident with the USS Theodore Roosevelt, where the commanding officer, the captain, was let go after he complained about his about the presence of coronavirus on his ship.
Oh my God, yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And what's interesting, what was funny, and what was so great to have Tweed write this piece was that Theodore Roosevelt did almost the exact same thing in Cuba, because he had been after the fighting, there was a siege, and then there was kind of an occupation after the Spanish surrendered, and all these soldiers were being kept down in the middle of the summer in terrible conditions with terrible food. Just really, the army did not treat them very well, and they were dying, and they were all getting dysentery and smallpox and yellow fever and malaria, and so Roosevelt and a number of other officers, they all wrote a letter, and Roosevelt put his name on it, and it went to the Secretary of War saying, this is unconscionable. We can't do this to these men. You have to do something now. And then it was leaked, kind of by design. And Roosevelt put his name on it because he knew that he wasn't a career soldier. So if he got fired or let go, it wasn't a big deal. But he also did it in the name of the soldiers, and it's not dissimilar to what happened with the USS Theodore Roosevelt. So anyway, it's kind of a roundabout story, but it was really fun to work with Tweed on that piece, which then, because his name was on, because he wrote it, got a huge readership, and maybe influenced certain people in their thinking about it. I don't know.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I admittedly I did miss that op-ed, but what a timely connection. And it also feels really crazy because that was in March, and that feels like 10 years ago. Because
no
it really does. Man, every day is like a year.
It really is. Okay, let's see. So Steve asks, how long did it take you to research and write this book? And how many versions did you go through before you sort of landed on the final copy?
Yeah. So it took me about 3 years to research, give or take a few months. And it took me about, you'd have to ask my editor how she feels about this. I would say it took me 2 drafts. She might say 3. It's tough. It's like, what's a draft and what's a thorough revision? There's definitely that first draft. I mentioned it to Rick. Had more Leonard Wood and more Richard Harding Davis in it. That changed significantly. There's a whole first chapter that I got rid of. So definitely, at least 2. Arguably 3. The research was a lot of fun. I went to Cuba to kind of walk around, see the and it's actually decently well preserved, the sites of some of these battles. Went out. There's a huge cache of Rough Rider material in, of all places, Las Vegas, New Mexico, not Nevada, but Las Vegas, New Mexico, which is a tiny town. Not tiny, I don't know. It's maybe a couple thousand people. About an hour east of Santa Fe. And for various reasons, the Historical Society there has a pretty fantastic collection of unpublished Rough Rider memoirs, letters, all kinds of material. It's really well maintained, really well indexed, so you can kind of walk in and just dive in as a researcher. But that was a lot of fun, and that really kind of, that's kind of the core of the book almost, is that collection.
Very cool. Very cool. So, and that sort of gets me to our last question. And if anyone else has any final questions, definitely submit them. We still have a few minutes in our time frame. So question came in from email that also asked about your research method. So that sort of, we answered that, but sort of piggybacking off of that, and quick little anecdote to this, but when I was researching my senior thesis as a history major, one of the things that I came across was this really awesome poem from the person I was researching to their wife. And it was about being a sea captain and how the Queen of England loved him, but no one was as fair or as lovely as his wife. And he sent this to her. And it was like the coolest thing that I found in my research. Do you have a favorite piece of research or a favorite primary document or article that you found during this book?
I have a couple. Okay. So I mentioned Theodore Miller. So his diary is just an amazing document, and it was just so much fun to. He was a very good writer, just as a young man, and so it really helped. He was also Thomas Edison was his brother-in-law. Yeah, his sister Thomas Edison was older, significantly older, but he married a very young woman who is this guy's sister. And so I also found a lot of letters from Thomas Edison about cool. Yeah. So that was crazy. I mean, that's one. Another one is the son of the founder, the inventor of Tabasco sauce on Avery Island in Louisiana. One of his sons became a Rough Rider, and there's some really fun course and the McElhaney company, they have a really good company archive, and they actually have some of this guy's letters and letters back and forth with his mother about fighting. And there's a whole letter about how, he went to San Antonio and then they were coming back by train to go to Florida, and they kind of passed through southern Louisiana. And so there's a whole back and forth about the food that she's going to bring to the train station for all of the men, and it's like, we want, this much, we want, a flagon of rum, and we want these sandwiches, and it's like a grocery list to his mother as they're passing through. So that was a lot of fun. And, there's Theodore Roosevelt has a great diary. And then, and Richard Harding Davis, his letters, he was a great writer and kind of forgotten today, but as a war correspondent and as a novelist, really good. And really, his novels are not that great, but his, they're fine. But his war correspondence, his journalism is really good, and it stands up today. It's very gripping. And then his letters, he was very close to his mother, who is, his mother was a literary figure in her own right and was good friends with Louisa May Alcott and some others. And so he really engaged correspondence with her. And, because I pulled him back in the book, a lot of that doesn't show up. Some of it does. But in the earlier drafts, I really kind of dove into it because his relationship with his mother was so poignant. Here's this guy who's this he really was a world famous journalist. Mm-hmm. And the only person he wanted to impress was his mother. And she loved him, and it wasn't an issue of withheld love. He took so much pride in her, and she took so much pride in him. And the letters bring that out. And so even though it's not in the book that much, having read that correspondence really, it really moved me. And as an experience in writing the book, it stuck with me.
Oh, I love that. That's awesome. Yeah. All right. Well, that kind of rounds us out to about an hour. And I feel like that was a good note to end on. So
great.
For those who registered and might be here now and missed the beginning of our talk, this is going to be recorded. And after this ends, you'll be able to rewatch from the beginning. And then absolutely, please buy the book. It's awesome, and absolutely take a chance to read it. That would be great. And then just really quick, since we have one more question, if you don't mind.
No.
Laura asked, she was just curious if you went to Gasparilla or Tampa, since she says there was a very active Rough Rider crew there. I imagine you were.
Yeah, actually, funny you should mention that. I was going to go there this year, and I didn't so the Rough Rider crew, for those who don't know it, and I didn't really know this before I started, but Tampa has a very lively crew culture, kind of like New Orleans, right? So a lot of parades that are run by social organizations. And one of them, in fact, one of the largest, is a Rough Rider themed crew. Yeah, that is about 540 people, and they actually had me down back in the fall. I went down there. They had one of their sort of monthly social Fridays, and we had a blast. I had so much fun with those guys. They were a great group of guys, and men and women, a great group of people, from all walks of life, and all of them just kind of invested in this story. And so that was a lot of fun. And of course I got to see Tampa, and got to see Tampa was, for those who haven't read the book or don't know, Tampa was the site where all of the army units got together, and then they embarked for Cuba. So this big flotilla left Tampa for Cuba. So but they spent time there before they left, so they really left a historical mark on the city. And so this crew celebrates that. And so their big festival every year. They sort of, different large crews are responsible for different parades. Theirs is the St. Patrick's Day parade. And unfortunately,
couldn't go.
Coronavirus intervened, and I was not able to go. But it was a shame. So maybe next year. It sounds like a lot of fun. I'd love to get there someday.
Yeah, absolutely. That's awesome. Well, thank you for answering that last question. Much appreciated. And again, thank you, Rick. Thank you, Clay. This was
Clay. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you to you, both of you.
I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your evening. And thank you to everyone who tuned in tonight. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. All right. Have a great night, everyone.
All right.
Bye.